welcome everyone to this lunchtime webinar to launch our new set of research briefings on earning while learning student employment. I'm Professor Kim Allen and I'm PI of the ESRC project on which this research is based, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Dr. Kirsty Finn from the University of Manchester and Professor Rachel Cohen from City St George's, University of London. And we're really delighted to welcome you here to kind of discuss some of the key findings that are presented in these research briefings and our recommendations for key stakeholders, including the education sector, employers and trade unions. And these briefings, which we launched formally last week, 3 sets of briefings that are on our website. We will also provide a link again to these for those who haven't seen them yet. Are written by the broader research team. So I want to kind of acknowledge and thank my colleagues, Professor Kate Hardy, who's here today, Dr. Lilith Brewers, who also contributed to the writing of the research briefings, and 2 colleagues who have left the project but were really fundamental to the data collection and analysis. That's Cassie King at the University of Sheffield and Mia Zhang, who's based at the University of Leeds. Just to give you a bit of an outline of what we're planning to do today, we want to give you an introduction to or kind of background to the research briefings and why we think it's really important to think about student employment, why does earning while learning matter, and how we've come about this as part of the wider project. I'm then going to hand over to Kirsty and Rachel, who are going to go through some of the key findings that are contained within the briefings, before going through some of the recommendations that we presented for these key stakeholders in addressing some of the issues that we've identified in the research related to young people's experiences of earning while learning. And then really we want to open it out to a Q&A section at the end of the webinar as well. So just a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording this seminar, so if there's any issues, if you don't want any of your questions, for example, to be included, just let us know. If you can keep yourselves muted throughout the chat. If you do have questions, you can obviously type them into the chat function or raise your hand at the end when we'll be gathering questions then. So just to go through then the kind of context and background for the research. As I said, this comes from a larger ESRC project that's looking at young women's working lives, and in particular focused on young women's earliest experiences of work. And we know, of course, that educational institutions and national policy has long been concerned with young people's employability. And there's lots of initiatives that take place in schools about engaging young people with employers and in the workplace, work experience placements, and also a push, of course, for young people to gain that experience through things like internships and work placements. However, this is very much about focusing on young people's transitions once they leave education. But we know, of course, that many young people are already engaging in work whilst they're in education, from school age upwards. So in the UK, but also globally, young people are engaging in paid work alongside their studies. For instance, we know at university level that the majority of young people work while studying at some point during their educational studies. So, for example, the very large multinational study, the Euro Student Project, finds that on average, 59% of university students across Europe are in paid employment during their studies. And this is a trend that's been increasing over time. And we also know that not only are more young people working alongside their studies, but they're also working more hours as well. And income from paid employment is an increasing proportion of university students' general income as well. And of course, we know that there are increasing kind of pressures on young people, which increase the necessity to engage in paid work alongside study, not least the ongoing cost of living crisis, but also the cost of learning crisis, as many commentators have identified. And we can trace this, of course, to a broader marketisation of higher education and the increase of fees and general cost of living that students are facing whilst they're engaging in education. Now, for us, there is a growing interest in earning while learning and student employment. However, this is framed in quite a narrow way. So when we think about existing understandings of earning while learning, there's a real focus on the kind of impact of this paid work, either as facilitating future careers and employability. And again, we can think about the kind of emphasis on internships and work placements that are very much related to young people's careers, or alternatively, we see how paid work is often kind of framed as a distraction to young people and as a hindrance to young people's academic achievement. We also know that from our own research and through observing the ways in which earning while learning is discussed within educational policy, but also by employers and to some extent by young people themselves, that this paid work that they undertake during their studies is often framed as kind of temporary, as incidental, and as not really real. It's kind of this work that they do before they enter the labour market. And we can see also how this is reproduced through dominant conceptualizations of, for example, labour market entry, or ideas about first jobs or entry jobs that are very much focused on those forms of employment that young people take up once they have officially exited university. And because of this kind of quite narrow and binary thinking, then the nature of earning while learning and the lived experiences of students and engaging with paid work alongside their studies is rarely considered. And this is where our project seeks to intervene. And in particular, we have argued that we need to reframe earning while learning as part of young people's or individuals' working life course. And it's just as significant as those forms of employment that young people engage in once they have left education. In particular, we think this is important in thinking about how these experiences of paid work might relate to broader inequalities that we know exist within the labour market and shape young people's transitions. And in particular, how these experiences of paid work alongside study might shape young people's understandings of work, might shape their values, their decisions about where they want to go in the future. So it's really about moving that spotlight onto earning while learning as significant to young people's transitions in the future. So as I said, this research and the briefings that we're presenting today draw on a broader study that's funded by the UKRI under an initiative called Transforming Working Lives. So we are one of 7 projects that's funded by the UKRI that's looking at contemporary work and work experiences in the UK. Our project within this cohort is focused on youth and gender in particular. However, as we argue today, our findings really relate not only to young women, but students in general. So the project is mixed method, and we draw on a number of different data sources. We're going to be presenting today from 2 of the work packages, one of which is an analysis of high quality national UK survey data, in particular the annual population survey and next steps data. But we also complemented this with qualitative research, which explored young women's experiences of paid work. And for this, we conducted focus groups with young women aged 14 to 23 in schools, colleges and universities across England, and really getting a real diverse sample of young people engaged in earning while learning, and looking at a diverse spread of institutions as well. We are also, we should say, as part of the project, also looking at young women once they leave education and really those earliest experiences of work once they once they leave education, and looking at then the kind of continuities and trends across those experiences from earning while learning into those first jobs post-education. And this is ongoing work that we'll be hopefully presenting and sharing findings from towards the end of the year. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Rachel, who's going to go through some of the key findings from the quantitative analysis.
Thanks, Kim. And so let's go to the next slide. Thanks. So I guess I was going to say most of what I'm going to present here comes from the annual population survey, that we have done some analysis of next steps, and we use other data sets in what I'm showing you here. And I want to just remind everybody who, if you're unfamiliar with looking at quantitative data, it has its limitations. There are definitely work that is not captured in people's responses. And most of the analysis is cross-sectional, so you don't necessarily know whether people have been working a few weeks before but are no longer working. So it undercounts student work, we would say, in lots of ways by omitting more informal work that certainly came up in our focus groups and omitting occasional work. Nonetheless, these quantitative sources show us that if you look across time at people, and this is where the next steps data is really useful because it's a longitudinal survey, most people have engaged in work prior to leaving full-time study. When you look cross-sectionally, most student workers are concentrated in just a couple of key sectors and in a few roles. So over half of students are engaged in jobs in just two sort of occupational categories, which include sales assistants, sort of retail cashiers, and elementary service occupations, things like bar staff, coffee shop workers, and waitressing and waiting tables, none of which is probably a surprise to anybody. And that means that even though students are just 4% of the overall labour force, which you might think is relatively small, if you look in particular sectors and particular roles, they might be as many as 20% of all workers. And so for those roles, student workers are really key. And although most students tend to work relatively few hours, so more than half of students are working, the vast majority of students, sorry, are working under 16 hours a week, which doesn't seem like a major commitment. If you think about it in terms of the days that they're working, most students are working at least 3 days a week. And so it is taking up a considerable portion of their time. And again, APS data show that students tend to be in their jobs for a relatively long period. I mean, not long in terms of maybe sort of like more mature jobs that you have, but they're not these jobs that people are coming into and out of, with about 40% of students having been in their jobs for at least a year.
Hello. Yeah.
One of, I think, the key findings that came out of this study, and something that echoes some of the previous research into student workers, is that women are much more likely to engage in paid work while studying than young men. And we found this at age 16 to 17, we found this at age 17 to 18, and we found this at age, 20 plus. So that means that across the sort of work educational life course, working while learning, earning while learning is a gender issue. And this came through in different kinds of data. So we looked at the Cosmo survey, which specifically looked at education and 16 to 18-year-olds. And in that data, 15.5% of women and 9.9% of men, 17.3% of non-binary students were working. In a different data set, the APS data set, we found that it was 31% of women as compared to 23.8% of men. So you can see across these two different data sets with different estimates, slightly different age groups, what is consistent is that women are more likely to be earning while learning than men. And I just want to talk about one of the key things that comes out of the data is that pay is low. It is low for most students. For the large majority, it's under the adult minimum wage or living wage. But there are a large proportion of students who are also earning under the age-specific, legally mandated minimum wages. And obviously there is not a minimum wage for students 16 and under, and Kirsty will tell you a little bit more about our qualitative data and what we found in terms of pay in those data. But just from the quantitative data, it's really clear that students are being paid really badly in the work that they're doing. Conversely, there is not a gender pay gap. So men and women are paid pretty similarly, but that's because they're all paid pretty badly. So across gender and ages, because most people are concentrated in just a few roles, and those roles tend to be some of the lowest paid roles in the labour market, we could guess it's a sort of, instead of a gender utopia, it's a gender dystopia in terms of pay. I'm going to hand over now to Kirsty, who is going to flesh out some of that using the qualitative data.
Thanks, Rachel. Thank you for that. So yeah, I'll provide a brief overview of the findings from the focus groups that we undertook with women in schools. So these were sort of 14 to 16 in further education and within higher education settings, university settings predominantly. And as Rachel has said, the main issues that came up in those focus groups when we tried to drill down into some of those things that we'd seen in the quantitative data were conversations about pay, how pay was negotiated. Quite often, I think we got the sense that these were the first time the women had spoken openly with each other about pay, and there were lots of taboos about pay, but generally they reported really low, potentially illegal treatment with regarding to pay. Some of the quotes there show how when national minimum wage changes came into effect, these were not carried through to their payments. They had to be chased, or the women, particularly when they were younger, had to go through parents to try and get those turned over. And it wasn't unusual for students to be required to do a trial shift or more than one trial shift, and these were predominantly unpaid. There were lots of conversations about doing these shifts, never hearing back from employers, and sort of giving up their time for free. And it kind of led to very low expectations and low perceptions of themselves as workers and of work itself. They would often be paid late, or particularly when they were doing work with, say, within personal networks, which was very common amongst the school age women. Having to sort of talk about pay was very awkward. There were kind of ideas about whether or not you could mention that. But it was also about bad conditions as well. And as the examples and the experiences that were discussed in the focus groups changed, particularly in different ages, depending on where the women were working, we heard lots of stories about sexual harassment at work. This was particularly widespread for women who were working in nighttime economies, nightclubs, and where alcohol was consumed, but not limited to those spaces, we should say. There was lots of issues around travel and getting to and from work when shifts were late, and in some settings that were maybe less urban and public transport was relied upon. And this generally led to lots of students reporting exhaustion. I mean, when we did an emoji task with students, and they shared that they were tired, they were exhausted. And as Rachel has said, they were often working, even if it was 16 hours, across their entire weekend and then studying during the week. So these conditions had a real knock-on effect for how they felt in themselves and were able to study. And when we think about the issues around pay, sometimes it was a lack of knowledge, and we did find that in those conversations where women were having these open conversations for the first time with one another about how they negotiated pay, how they found out about when they got paid, some of them just didn't have a clue about that in the earlier, younger focus groups. But many of them did know, and they did have an understanding of what they should be paid and could be paid, but they were very, very reluctant to challenge or to sort of have a voice within their working environments. When they were aware of their rights, they were really also aware that activating those and raising issues and concerns might lead to them no longer being on the sort of preferential list when rotas were being drawn up. They would be effectively ghosted by employers because they brought up something that was difficult or challenging. And in that fear of being replaced, knowing there's this kind of ready pool of cheap labour, of other young students who also need work and need hours, they felt incredibly disposable. They were easily replaced, and it really undermined their willingness to raise concerns. We also saw real gendered and racialised discussions about it being impolite to raise these things and how they would come across in terms of challenging poor pay, poor conditions, and rights, and particular experiences around witnessing sexual harassment or experiencing discrimination and issues related to age and gender in the workplace. And this led to a reluctance of wanting to bring things up with managers who there was not always a lot of confidence that managers would even do anything even if they were sort of sympathetic at the local level. They were very pessimistic about the amount of change that would come from them raising the issues, and they were more worried about them being then kind of labelled as somebody who was trouble or difficult to work with. The students talked a lot about flexibility and how important that was for them. They needed work to be flexible to fit around their studies. But once we sort of dug into that, we realised that that flexibility tended to work in one way. So they'd have little choice over their shift patterns. Often they would get a rota on a Sunday evening for that week. And again, if they couldn't make those shifts, that led to penalties further down the line where they were then not thought of or not given that kind of not given a look in to get the shifts. And so they were really anxious about how and when they said no to shifts. It was employers who really had the upper hand when it came to that flexibility. So these 0-hour contracts exist. Students could wait months on end for a shift, and then they really would have to take it, not to forfeit being asked again. And this long periods of time without shifts or having shifts cancelled at the last minute obviously leads to things like financial precarity. Pay was so important, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this in a second. But with pay being such, so essential for everyday living, that this flexibility really was not for the women we spoke to, really, certainly not as they got older and moved into higher education. And it really led to reduced well-being as well in their everyday lives. So yeah, we don't want to paint a picture that work was only valued in those terms for the women. And they did talk about the value that work brought, and in that context of cost of living, reduced opportunities for going out and experiencing that broader student life because of how expensive it is just to socialise. Lots of the students talked about how part-time work gave them a space to meet with friends. Often they worked amongst other young people. They would talk about how much of a laugh they would have. The flip side of feeling disposable and feeling like you don't matter is you also regard the work as not really mattering very much, except for what it brings sort of socially. So there were lots of conversations about going to work, having a laugh, messing around, and it was really important for their broader experiences of being students. But also they reflected on their growing sense of independence. So whilst in those earlier focus groups, often that work was attached to family connections, mum's friend or dad's partner, and doing a few hours here and there. As they got older, there's lots of reflections on working for bigger companies, which had good and bad things attached to that. But often feeling that more anonymous, being part of bigger companies, having workmates led to a sense of independence and skills development that they really valued, even if there was a sense that this work wasn't real work. In that broader narrative about what earning whilst learning is, it was really clear from them that they were developing things that made them feel like rounded workers. And this actually the amount of experience that some of the women have by higher education is just huge across different sectors, different job types. But ultimately, whilst there were those benefits for students and that valuing of that work, there was a real emphasis on it being essential. So the income from part-time work was essential for these women to continue in education and sometimes to provide for their families as well. So they were either not wanting to ask families for support, or they were actually supporting families in some instances. So even though they enjoyed their work, as I've said, and these kind of new responsibilities, they often felt very devalued. And that goes back, I think, to that point about being quite replaceable and sort of interchangeable. You're just another student worker. And there were other things I think that were really important for us who work in education, is that there was kind of a lack of understanding from the employers who were largely indifferent or uncaring about students needing a break during exam period or having to reduce shifts to accommodate some of the pressures of study, but also of teachers, lecturers and people working in education who were quite dismissive of part-time jobs. And so they felt kind of devalued in two separate ways. And it was having a huge impact on their financial sustainability and on their well-being. And they felt really caught between these two spaces that they were ultimately spending the most of their time in. I'll hand over to Kim now for some recommendations, I think.
Thank you, Kirsty. Thank you. Yeah. So as we said, we've developed 3 briefings. They're presenting the findings, but targeting them very much at different stakeholder groups. So one, as I said, for the education sector, another for employers and industry, and then for trade unions. And within each of those briefings, there's a targeted set of recommendations. And really, I think I'm not going to be able to spend time talking through all of these, but I just want to pull out some of the kind of key headings, I think, in terms of what we're really urging these stakeholders to do. I think one thing, obviously, that, as we've identified, although many students work, what we're seeing is that earning while learning is a gendered issue. It's a gendered phenomena. Young women are much more likely than their male counterparts to be engaging in earning while learning. And that means they're much more likely to be navigating these kind of challenges and difficulties in relation to pay, of poor conditions. And really, then we think this must be understood as an equality issue, and that educational institutions and the sector has a duty to address these and to support students. And I think for us, what we are arguing is that banning students or restricting students from working is not the way to go. That's not likely to be effective, particularly given how important paid work is for many students and the various benefits and meanings that are attached to that work. Instead, we really think that energy needs to be focused on supporting students and providing guidance and advice for students around their rights at work, and really working to improve those conditions of work for students, as well as kind of thinking about how paid work can be facilitated as part of students' lives and experience. So we think that there's real scope for careers advice and guidance, but also broader employability initiatives to address earning while learning, to include these experiences of work within the work that they do with students. So not just simply focused on students as workers in the future and what they might do once they leave education, but thinking about how those spaces within the curriculum, within careers advice and guidance, can really focus on their current experiences of work. And we think there's real value and scope for that. As Kirsty identified, sexual harassment of various kinds, sexual misconduct, low-level, kind of banter, these things to kind of inappropriate touching was a commonplace part of students' experiences of paid work. And we know that within the education sector, there's a great deal of important work that's happening around sexual violence, sexual misconduct, but that's primarily about what happens on campus or within schools and colleges. And we really think that there's scope, again, to broaden that to include students' experiences across the board, including their experiences of paid work. One thing that we also argue throughout our recommendations is a real need for collaboration between these different stakeholders. So in particular, how educational institutions can work with trade unions, particularly those that represent the sectors that we know students are concentrated in. So in particular, hospitality and retail, to educate students about their rights at work. And there is already great stuff that is happening by unions. There's lots of great resources for young workers, not specifically students, but for young workers around their rights at work. And there's, I think, scope to really develop that so it's much more targeted on students. And of course, collaborating with employers as well, in particular those who offer the living wage, but also those that are recognised through local good work or good employment charters. In Manchester, for example, we have a good employment charter. So thinking about how educational institutions can work with those employers that are recognised through that and promoting those opportunities to their students. For employers and industry, of course, unsurprisingly, we're really calling for employers to pay a real living wage to workers, regardless of age. And we really think there is a need to move away from the age-based rates for pay for workers. We're also arguing for ending the use of trial shifts for workers, for which workers receive no pay. And I think just going back to some of the data that Rachel shared, and from our own data, we know that students want stable jobs, and that for many students, they are working with employers for a longer period of time. But of course, students' lack of rights, avenues for voice, it encourages them to leave. Okay, and I think this goes back to this idea of student workers as kind of disposable and exploitable. And we think there's real potential for improving those conditions of student workers in order to reduce turnover for employers. Developing robust strategies for ensuring that sexism and sexual harassment are reduced really need to be expanded to include student workers who we know are particularly vulnerable to those forms of mistreatment in the workplace. And as I've already mentioned, engaging with these local and regional good work or employment charters. And this is, I guess, some repetition of what we've argued, what I've already mentioned, but I think students are a really important and organisational section of the workforce. And although we know that there's pockets of great work that's done by trade unions, we really think that there's more work that could be done to engage and target student workers specifically. So rather than seeing them as kind of temporary or transitory, really about thinking about engaging those workers, which I think engaging them as members from the off will have kind of positive outputs across the working life course. We know, as I said, that there is already some materials that are out there about engaging young workers, but thinking about how these can be developed and promoted within schools, within colleges and universities to engage students would be really important. And again, really expanding those campaigns around sexual harassment and sexism in the workplace that trade unions are doing great work on to include student workers that allow them to identify and report these issues. So we have kind of gone through those key findings and recommendations. We really would encourage and hope that you will read the briefings